Hello everybody, and welcome to the Maybe Later show. Although it might not appear obvious given our current selection of videos, this channel was very much created as an outlet for an interest in linguistics. Our original main series, quote-unquote, was Languages of the World, wherein we would discuss, well, the languages of the world. Of course, this sort of fell to the wayside after we got stuck on English grammar, and then life got in the way to produce the channel you know today with its very infrequent upload schedule. However, I do still harbor an interest for linguistics, and one manifestation of that interest is my expansive collection of books on language. I have a terrible habit of purchasing books whenever I'm given the chance, which means that my library expands by 4 or 5 books every month, while I only read 1 or 2 a month. One of these books I purchased from a secondhand bookstore, and it's our topic for discussion today. The book in question is entitled Uncovering the Logic of English, A Common Sense Approach to Reading, Spelling, and Literacy by American educator and businesswoman Denise Eide. For a quick biography, Eide received a master's degree in curriculum and education from the University of Minnesota and became involved in ESL teaching in Russia, where she discovered that, quote, Eastern Europeans think systematically about language, unquote. She later faced a similar debacle when her son struggled with reading and writing English, and so determined, she came up with a new method of teaching spelling, based on the Orton-Gillingham approach and documented in the book that I bought back in June of 2025. This is all very well and good, and I will agree that it's a noble pursuit. There is a significant number of English speakers who cannot read or write the language, and I want to make it clear that I think overall this book is a net good for educators. However, I disagree with a lot of its methodology, and I think it's worth discussing why. After rereading the book and taking pages of notes, I've prepared an argument that I hope will be convincing. With that, let's roll the intro and get into it. To start, I just want to address some of the strange decisions that I'd made while writing this book, and some of her personal biases that seemed to have seeped in. Firstly, and I understand that this isn't much of a problem for most readers, but it was very annoying for me, Eide proudly proclaims there to be 15 vowel sounds in English and lists their IPA transcriptions as such. This is not the IPA, it's some sort of weird version of it, one of many that educators have made up to teach English phonology. Eide also provides examples as to what each of these symbols sound like in actual words to clear things up. In my accent, some of these different symbols sound exactly the same, which surely wasn't her intention. And even then, I speak a very regular Western/general American English, so my vowel pronunciations are nowhere near the most extreme they could be. Many of these words are pronounced in vastly different ways, even just within the United States. If I'd had to find these symbols using the IPA rather than with words they appear in, this problem could have been avoided, but alas. You'll come to see throughout this video that Eide doesn't really think much about speakers with accents or dialectal differences from her own flavor of English, even going so far as to call their pronunciations exceptions to the rules. For consistency and simplicity's sake, I've translated all of her symbols into the IPA in the method shown on screen, and these IPA adaptations will be used for the rest of the video. Just know that every time you see this, I had to stare at this, or this, for a few seconds before I figured out what I'd meant. Continuing on this idea of teaching across dialects, Eide advocates exaggerating the pronunciations of words that don't usually align very well with their spellings. It's not again, it's again, it's not the, it's the, and so on and so forth. While some of these are somewhat historically accurate pronunciations of these words, they are very clearly not how they're pronounced most often in casual conversation, and definitely not how these kids are used to hearing them said. I don't have any conclusive evidence that this affects learning to spell one way or the other, but it feels a little off. In her description of the literacy crisis, Eide details what intensive phonics as an idea is, and sadly laments that American students aren't being taught phonics, or even that phonics is some sort of forbidden secret that Big English doesn't want you to know. She quotes a 3rd grade teacher who attended one of her master classes. Quote, "This is my last resort. My principal will not allow me to teach intensive phonics in the classroom, but I am paying for my own training and using my own money to buy the kids' materials. I plan to close the door and teach the children the logic of English. It makes so much sense. If it works, I will tell the administration, and if it does not, I'm quitting. I cannot continue failing these kids year after year." Unquote. Now, disregarding the fact that if a teacher is failing her students the same way year after year, it may be her own fault, there's something else here in the idea that administrators are not allowing their teachers to tell students the truth about English, when in reality I find it incredibly hard to believe that this is ever the case. I think the issue here is more that these are third grade students who should theoretically already know how to read and write, and that this principal doesn't see a purpose in investing in resources to teach them something they should have already learned. Whether we should be expecting third graders to be proficient in these skills is an entirely different discussion, but the fact is that no one is forbidding the teaching of phonics. It's an odd angle to take, and a horse-eyed mounts herself upon various times throughout the book. There are two more quirks in this book's presentation that I thought were worth mentioning. The first is Eide's insistence through her rules that English words do this, or English words don't do this. For instance, Rule 3 states that English words do not end in I, you, v, or j. The exceptions to this rule are the three pronouns I, you, and thou, of which she offers no explanation as to their differing from the standard, and a slew of borrowed words like macaroni, ski, caribou, and menu. The best explanation for these words, Eide says, is to teach students that they are not English words, which they very clearly are. Words that aren't English generally aren't commonly used in casual conversation to the extent that these exceptions are. If she meant that these are somehow less English because they came from other languages, so does the word phonics and logic in her own surname, Eide, but these are all English words nonetheless. Teaching that some foreign words are fully English but others aren't quite there, and that's why they don't follow our spelling rules, is a teaching practice that doesn't quite sit right with me. I think you either have to teach that most English words aren't purely Germanic derived, or that words like ski and menu are fully English, but you can't do both. Finally, there is a hint of sexism that lingers throughout the entire book. It presents itself firstly on page 27 when Eide categorizes two types of learners: intuitive learners and logical learners. She then goes on to say that most girls are intuitive learners and most boys are logical learners, which is why boys struggle more with spelling than girls do. Then she says that logical learners specifically, boys, are the future engineers, mathematicians, and scientists. She ends off the section with, "At a time in history when our economy relies on advancements in science and engineering, we cannot afford to impair these gifted citizens by not teaching them English in a manner that respects how their minds work." I agree with the overall sentiment that different people learn in different ways. However, I wouldn't use the categories logical and intuitive, and I definitely wouldn't tie them specifically to boys and girls. Perhaps this is a woke 2026 sensitivity. This book was published in 2011, but I take issue with it regardless. Moving on. When we teach children the alphabet, we give the false impression that English has only 31 sounds. To provide students with a more complete understanding of English, they must master not only 26 letters, but the 74 basic phonograms. In the very front of the book, Eide makes the claim that English is phonetic. In the very back of the book, Eide supplies the reader with several appendices that are long lists of what she's discussed throughout the main body. There is a list of common irregular verbs, prefixes and suffixes, non-American spellings, and, most useful to us, two lists of phonograms. One is of the aforementioned 74 basic phonograms, and another is of the 42 advanced phonograms. Eide doesn't spend much time on the advanced phonograms and only professes the basic ones to be necessary. However, I would argue that the sounds these advanced phonograms make are just as important to know, even if they appear less frequently. Either way, using Eide's model, children must memorize between 74 and 116 different possible sounds that a letter or series of letters can make, disregarding all instances of silent letters and some other sounds she doesn't mention. A lot of these would be much more simply described in some other ways. For instance, Eide writes that GU is a phonogram that makes the sound GW in words like language and iguana, and therefore one that must be taught to students. However, I think it is much more simple to teach students that the GUA in both of these words is just a quickly spoken GUA. That lines up much better with the spelling of the word and makes more intuitive sense. There are countless examples of things like this throughout the book, which leads me to my next point. How practical is it for reading-age children to be learning all of these phonograms on top of the 30 spelling rules? When children first arrive to the classroom at 4 or 5 years old, they don't only need to be taught how to spell words, they need to be taught what a word is. They need to be taught what spelling is, how to recognize and write the 26 different letters of the alphabet in both their upper and lowercase forms, and, before that, how to hold a pencil. This is already a lot of work bestowed on these students and their teachers, and kindergarten classrooms are for more than literacy. These teachers are responsible for teaching the concepts of numbers and basic arithmetic, early social studies, and beginning science skills. They have to do this while keeping it all engaging for a group of 30 rambunctious young children. I just don't see how it's possible to teach all of these complex rules in this environment. The Orton Gillingham website, Orton Gillingham being one of Eide's cited inspirations, says that the approach works best one-on-one or with small groups of students, which makes a lot of sense. The system Eide describes in this book would definitely be more effective in tutoring sessions rather than in class-wide pedagogy. Moreover, a lot of these rules are very complicated and difficult to teach. For instance, Rule 14 states as follows: double the last consonant when adding a vowel suffix to words ending in one vowel followed by one consonant, only if the syllable before the suffix is accented. I would like to see you try and explain that to a 5-year-old. A lot of Eide's teaching also seems to be not very aware of how most young kids' minds work. If you've ever interacted with anyone younger than 6 or 7, then you'll know the beloved word that permeates their vocab: why? You can't explain anything to a little kid without their curiosity getting the best of them like this. This is a habit that obviously manifests when you learn to read and write. Why does th say th? Why does det have a b? Why is it one bus and 2 buses, but one octopus and 2 octopi? Eide's strategies may seem like they would make much more sense for these children. For example, imagine a kid asking why ti says sh in action, or why ci and si behave the same way in words like social and tension, respectively. Eide answers these questions with Rule 17. Ti, ci, and si are used to mean sh only at the beginning of any syllable after the first one. This is fair enough. You wouldn't spell fish as ghoti or radish as radici. However, this invites the same question. Just because now we know ci can only say sh in some contexts doesn't explain why it says sh. The real way to teach this would be to demonstrate the palatalization that happens when you try to pronounce social as written. If you say it often enough and quickly enough, over time the sya becomes a sh, and that's precisely what happened when this word was developing. Eide seems averse from this teaching strategy, however, and would rather add more letter combinations to her long list of phonograms and restrictions to her list of rules than teach them history. If making English make sense is truly her goal, then knowing the why of these words will not only appease curious young kids, but make them easier to learn. All of these criticisms have assumed that the rules and phonograms Eide has come up with are fundamentally sound. Perhaps she just isn't very good at explaining the best methods of teaching them. However, the fact of the matter is that a lot of these rules and phonograms aren't fundamentally sound. Let's take a look at some of those more thoroughly. I don't want to spend too much time bashing Eide's rules and phonograms because she's primarily a curriculum creator, not a phonetician or linguist or English scholar. However, some of these are just pretty bad. Let's address that earlier claim she made that English has only 15 vowel sounds, which includes diphthongs. This is just incorrect for most speakers of the language. In my idiolect alone, I use a as in pat, as in pot, I as in pit, as in pet, as in put, as in put, a as in pay, o as in pone, e as in peak, oo as in poof, I as in pine, oi as in poise, ow as in pow, r as in par, or as in pork, ear as in peer, air as in pear, as in purr. No shame if you couldn't count all of those, it's a lot. 18 to be precise, and I didn't even count schwa and schwa-derived vowels. I also speak a fairly benign variety of English. Received pronunciation, for example, employs several triphthongs as well as versions of all of those previous vowels. This isn't to say that no one who speaks English speaks it with only 15 vowels, but I would be willing to bet that most people do not. Besides that, there are a lot of phonograms that don't strike me as being completely accurate. EAR says as in search, and no other sounds, never mind words like bear or fear. Similarly, OA says O as in coat, but not as in abroad or boa constrictor. I is listed as a phonogram that can be a consonant in words like onion, where it says yuh. This is definitely a way you could analyze this word, but again, is it really simpler to say that I is sometimes a consonant that makes the same sound as Y, or that onion is just spoken quickly? Another phonogram that's really strange to me is BU, as in buy or build. This one apparently just says buh, which, okay, sure, maybe in those words, but what about the vast majority of times BU appears, like in the word but, which ranks around the 20th most frequently used word in the English language? The word is not pronounced but. The easiest way to explain these oddities would, again, be through history, but of course Eide has no interest in that. This claim is like saying that the sequence UB is sometimes a vowel because it says the sound in subtle. Eide early on also makes the claim that every syllable of an English word must have a written vowel. I won't delve too much into this because what exactly a written vowel is can be debated. However, using her definition of A, E, I, O, U, and Y, R, and L in some contexts, there are several exceptions. Words like prism, logarithm, feminism, and sarcasm all come to mind. In terms of the spelling rules themselves, most of them are pretty alright. I still question their ability to be taught well, but I can acknowledge that they describe how English spelling works in most cases. There are a few rules in particular, however, that bother me. Rule 12.6 is a rule about when a silent E is placed at the end of a word, and it reads as follows. Add an E to a word to make the word look bigger. That's it. Her entire explanation for this is that some words have an E at the end of them that would otherwise be inexplicable. Of course, all of these words have real reasons that the E is there, but Eide, for once, seems to be simplifying a rule for children and just makes up whatever she wants. Rule 12.9 is similar. Silent E is placed at the end of a word for an unseen reason. The words that fall into this category just so happen to be some of the most frequently used in English, like done, come, some, where, and were. It seems a bit hand-wavy to me to say that one of the most fundamental spelling rules of English is that sometimes we put E at the end of a word and we don't know why. Rule 14 is another rule I take issue with, not necessarily because it's inaccurate, but just because it's very lengthy and complex. I've already read it once, but it's up on the screen for your viewing pleasure now. The biggest problem I have with this rule is that it's basically useless if you're not using American spellings. Later on, for example, she goes through how to add the ed suffix to the word travel, and following her handy flowchart arrives at traveled, except if you live outside the US, then you'll know that the word for you is spelled with two L's, not just one. Again, Eide's pseudo-xenophobia shows up. Rule 15 is another one with a lot of obvious exceptions that Eide herself points out. Single vowel Y changes to I when adding any ending, unless the ending begins with I. As she herself says, single-syllable words ending in a single vowel Y present the greatest number of exceptions to a logic of English spelling rule. However, put into perspective, there are only 14 words which are exceptions. Of the thousands of words ending with Y, these still represent less than 1%. None of these exceptions are particularly uncommon, but because they make up less than 1% of words ending with Y, Eide glosses over them and moves on. Finally, Rule 30 is another very hand-wavy rule. We often double F, L, and S after a single vowel at the end of a base word. Occasionally, other letters also are doubled. This last part, occasionally other letters also are doubled, is so frustrating and very obviously a way to explain away the myriad of words she lists on the next page. In practice, though, how useful is a spelling rule that says sometimes we double letters? Not very, I think. I want to re-emphasize the point that I don't think this is a bad book. I think trying to explain how English spellings works is a good thing to attempt, and this is definitely a step in the right direction. There's just way too many issues with it for me to endorse the teaching strategy, though. Anyway, I think I've gone on for long enough. Hopefully there will be another video either this March or this summer, although of course I'm not making any promises. Thanks for watching. I've been Alivelâ, and yes, that 6-7 was on purpose.